现在就让我们来欢迎菲律宾新爱国阵线的秘书长 Renato Royes Jr. 来为我们报告美军重返亚洲及对菲律宾的军事干涉。让我们以热烈掌声欢迎我们的秘书长。
大家好。So my name is Nato.
NATO 先生。
And I come from the organization called Bayan.
他的那个组织是新爱国阵线。
It's an alliance of workers, farmers, women, youth, professionals, all these sectors in Philippine society.
是一个属于青年、妇女、农民还有工人的一个联盟的组织。
And we've been fighting for national liberation, for the freedom of our country, for many years now.
新爱国阵线也致力于就是他们民族的解放。
To start off, let me ask you a question. How would you feel if a visitor would stay at your house for a year, for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years?
让我来问你们一个问题：如果有一个访客来到你们家里面，带着1年、2年、3年，甚至10年，你会觉得怎么样？
That wouldn't be right.
你觉得这样对吗？
Now, how would you feel if the police will sleep at your house and say that they want to sleep there, they want to live there because they want to protect you?
那你觉得如果有个警察就是说要睡在你家，然后说这是因为我要保护你，你觉得怎么样？
Surely nobody would want that. That wouldn't be right.
我很确定大家都不会希望这样子的事情发生，这样子是不对的。
And that has been our problem with the U.S. presence in the Philippines for many years now, for several decades now.
这就是这几十年来我们菲律宾人面临的问题。
That they came to our country, they put up U.S. bases, and they told us that they're there because they were our friends, and that they wanted to help us, they wanted to protect us.
因为他们来到我们菲律宾，然后建立基地，就告诉我们说他是我们的好朋友，他们想要保护我们。
But we fought that, and we drove the bases away out of our country in 1991.
那其实事实上，我们在1991年就已经把那个美军基地赶出菲律宾了。
But our special friends wanted to come back, and they have come back to our country.
但是这个特殊的朋友，他想要回来，而且他们已经回到菲律宾来了。
So can we go to the slides? Next slide. So after 1991, the U.S. wanted to come back to the Philippines and reestablish their presence in our country.
美国他在1991年之后就想要重返菲律宾，就是在继续建立那个军基地。
Next slide. The U.S. currently maintains a vast global network, some say about 700 military bases worldwide, occupying or basing in about 60 countries, not including the deployment of U.S. Special Forces in 156 countries currently.
所以其实美国在全球都企图要建立他们一个基地的网络，就是他们在60个国家里面有大约700个军事基地，而且其中还包含他们在156个国家里面也有军事的部署。
So through this, you can see that the U.S. is trying to establish its role as the global police, as the protector of the free world.
所以我们可以发现，美国其实是想要，就企图要做一个国际警察。
But in doing so, of course, it violates the sovereignty, the human rights, and the interests of the peoples worldwide.
但是他这么做却违反了当地的国家的主权还有人权。
Next slide. So in the Philippines, even without the U.S. bases, some 600 special forces, U.S. special forces, have been based in Mindanao, in southern Philippines, for the last 11 years.
所以事实上，就算是那个美军基地没有回来，在过去的11年间，在民根大河也有600名美国的特种部队待在那里。
And they're not there for sightseeing, they're not there to go to the beach or build schools, they're there to interfere in our domestic affairs.
他们在那边不是要观光，还是去海滩玩？他们其实在那边是要干涉菲律宾的国内事务。
And they tell us that they're just visitors. They're just visitors, but they've been there for the last 11 years.
不过他们却跟我们说，这些这种部队只是访客，不过他们却依访客的事情。
Next slide, please. So last year, around January 3, 2012, the U.S. announced a new strategy of rebalancing or putting more of its troops in the Asian region.
因为在去年2012年的1月3日，美国它宣布了要重返亚洲，然后把更多的军队放在亚洲地区。
So the Philippines was one of the countries that they targeted to put in more U.S. troops.
那个菲律宾就变成他们主要把军队放到这边的一个目标。
Next slide. Why does the U.S. want to do this?
所以为什么美国要这么做呢？
In their own words, they say that the economic and security interests of the U.S. are tied or linked to the developments in Asia.
美国是这么说，他说美国的经济和安全的利益是和这个亚洲地区紧紧相连的。
So what they're saying is that they want to put more troops, more ships in the Asian region because that's where the economic and security interests of the U.S. lie.
所以他们觉得说，既然亚洲地区是美国经济和安全利益就是所在之地，所以他们想要把他们更多的军队放在这个区域里面。
Next slide, please. So basically, they want to reclaim their former bases in the Philippines.
所以基本上他们其实是想要把他们原本在菲律宾的军事基地给要回来。
Next slide, please. So for example, since the U.S. wants to move out some troops from Okinawa, they're finding new hosts for these troops. And they're looking at the Philippines and possibly Guam.
那个美国他其实想要把他们在琉球的部队移出琉球之外，所以他现在想到的地方就是菲律宾还有关岛。
Next slide, please. Next slide. So more and more ships, more and more troops are coming in and out of our country. Every month, there's a U.S. warship or U.S. nuclear submarine that goes into the Philippines for refueling, supplies, and what they call rest and recreation.
所以在每个月有越来越多的美国的舰队和军队，甚至还有什么和平潜舰呐，他们就是来到菲律宾去加油，或是补给，或者是休息。
And every year we have the big military exercises involving thousands of U.S. troops and Filipino troops.
然后在每一年都会有许多军事演习，然后参与这些演习的军人数就是几乎有将近数千人的菲律宾跟美国士兵参与这些军事演习。
Next slide. So what is our government saying? How do they justify it? Why do they say that this is going to be good for the Filipinos?
所以呢，那菲律宾政府是怎么样说服菲律宾人说这个是对菲律宾人是有好处的？
So they justify this return of U.S. troops by saying that it will help the Philippines against China.
他其中一个理由是，他们跟菲律宾人说，美国来可以帮助我们菲律宾去抵抗那个中国的威胁。
particularly in the disputed area of the South China Sea.
特别是南中国海这个区域。
The Philippine government also says that the return of more U.S. troops would develop our armed forces, would make it modern.
菲律宾政府也说，美军回来的话，可以帮助我们菲律宾军队更加现代化。
The Philippines is also saying that other countries are doing it too. They're doing it in Japan, South Korea, so it's just okay for the Philippines to follow.
所以菲律宾也说，既然美国在日本、韩国都这么南韩都这么做，那其实在菲律宾这么做也是可以的。
But the Philippine government is telling us that these are just visitors. They're just here on a temporary basis. They're not real U.S. bases. They're not here permanently.
但是菲律宾政府也跟我们说，其实他们只是暂时来，他们是访客性质，这个是领职的，并不是一个就是长期的基地，这只是一个访问。
Next slide. But from what we're seeing, it's not true that they're just there temporarily.
所以，可是对我们所亲眼就是看到，其实这并不是一个暂时的访问。
We have a military agreement with the United States.
我们目前并没有那个军事的，我们。
We have a military agreement.
我们与那个美国有军事协议，之间有军事协议。
Which allows an unlimited number of U.S. troops to stay in the Philippines for an unlimited period of time.
这个协议会允许美国的军队就是在菲律宾就是无限次数、无限期的待在菲律宾。
To engage in undefined, unspecified kinds of activities.
然后他们所从事的活动也是不需要被我们监看，或者是他也不需要特别去说明他们要做什么事情。
So this violates our constitution and violates our national sovereignty.
这个协议其实是违反我们的宪法，也违反我们国家的主权。
Next slide, please. What the U.S. wants to happen is that they want countries like the Philippines to shoulder the burden, the responsibility, and the costs of hosting U.S. troops.
美国实际上是希望让菲律宾来负担这个，就是让美军军队驻扎的经费，就是让这些经费啊，然后这些就是让菲律宾来负担。
For example, because of the budget crisis in the United States, where they need to cut down costs, they're going to place the U.S. troops in Philippine facilities for us to be able to host them.
因为美国他们有遇到他们预算的一个危机和紧缩，所以他们想要就是把军队就放到菲律宾去，让他们去省下这个经费。
Next slide, please. Now, modernization. The Philippines, you know, is a third world country.
所谓现代化，就是大家知道，就是菲律宾就是所谓的第三世界。
We don't have a real navy.
我们没有真正自己的海军。
We don't have a real air force.
也没有空军部队。
We're made up of so many islands.
然后我们又有许多岛屿。
But we don't have enough boats to patrol all the islands.
我们也却没有一个舰队，就是可以去控制这些岛屿。
So the U.S. promised us that they will help us become a modern military power.
所以美国答应我们说要帮菲律宾，就是建立一个比较现代化的军队。
And that promise was made. That promise was made 50 years ago.
不过他这个承诺其实50年前就已经承诺过了。
And not much has changed after 50 years. We're still very backward.
不过经过50年过去之后，其实什么事都没有改变，我们还是军队还是很落后。
So you see in the picture, that's a U.S. Coast Guard patrol boat that was donated to the Philippines.
所以你看这个照片是美国的一个巡航母舰，就是待在菲律宾的巡航母舰。
And the Philippine government was very happy. Oh, we got the boat, yay!
就是菲律宾政府就是很高兴，觉得哦，我们有这个船了这样。
But you know that boat was first used during the Vietnam War.
但你知道这艘船其实第一次使用的时候是在越南战争的时候。
So that's what we're getting. That's what we're getting. We're getting second-hand military equipment from the United States.
所以你看，这就是我们从美国得到的东西，就得到一个二手的战舰。
So you can't really modernize, you can't really improve your capacity if that's all we're getting.
所以这其实并不是真正的现代化或是改善，这是我们得到的这些二手的东西。
Now, the U.S., the scary part here is that when they come to the Philippines, they also interfere in domestic affairs.
当美国就是来到菲律宾的时候，他们同时也就是干涉菲律宾国内的事务。
So during the Bush War on Terror, the U.S. troops were actually engaged in combat operations against suspected Islamic terrorists. War on Terror.
就是在那个布希他反恐战争时期，美军他们其实也就是在菲律宾从事反恐的事情。
So U.S. drones have been fired in Philippine territory, supposedly targeting suspected Islamic terrorists or militants.
美国的那个无人轰炸机，其实也有在菲律宾的国土里面执行任务，特别是他们就是以那个穆斯林恐怖主义者为目标执行就是无人轰炸的任务。
The U.S. soldiers admitted it, but the Philippine government denies it.
美国军人他们那个承认有这件事发生，不过菲律宾政府却否认有发生这种事情。
Next slide, please. Now, helping us against China, that's what the U.S. is saying. If they're there, it serves as a deterrent against China.
所以美国也就是答应说，如果中国有来威胁菲律宾的话，那他就会帮助我们，就是抵抗这个威胁。
But rather than being a force for peace, U.S. military presence actually escalates the tensions between China and the Philippines.
如果与其说它是为了就是让我们能够更加和平，不如说其实它美国到了菲律宾之后，反而让这个中菲之间的那个气氛更加的紧张。
For example, the U.S. would deliberately hold large military exercises in the South China Sea, which is obviously directed towards China.
举例来说，美国在中南海区域就是举行了非常多的军事操练，其实这个东西很明显的就是在针对中国。
While we, as Filipinos, oppose China's incursions in Philippine territory, we cannot allow the U.S. to intervene in such a situation because it will be counterproductive for everyone.
虽然我们菲律宾就是有反对，就是中国就是和菲律宾之间有这样子领土的争议，不过我们也不需要美国在这边就让事情变得更糟。
And we favor a diplomatic and peaceful resolution without any form of U.S. military intervention.
我们比较希望是透过外交跟和平的手段，而不是用透过美国干涉的手法来解决这件事情。
Next slide, please. Lately, one of the consequences of U.S. military presence in the country is that a U.S. ship, a U.S. minesweeper, got stuck in a reef in the Philippines.
最近发生的一件事情就是美国的一个扫雷舰，它在菲律宾的一个礁岩的地区搁浅了。
It's called the Tubataha Reef.
就是大家所熟知的杜巴塔哈礁。
One of the most beautiful places in the world with such great biodiversity that the United Nations declared it a World Heritage Site.
它是一个世界上非常美丽的地方，那个联合国也将它视为一个世界遗产的，就是有非常多丰富的自然资源。
And for some unexplained reason, this U.S. warship found its way in a protected area.
我们就不知道什么原因呢。总之，美国就是这个扫雷舰是自己跑到这个受到保护的区域里面。
So when the Philippine authorities, the local authorities, told the U.S. ship that you can't go there, the U.S. captain told the Philippine authorities go talk to the U.S. embassy.
所以当那个美国的官方跟这个扫雷舰的船长说你们不能够进入这个区域的时候，那个船长就跟菲律宾官方说，那你们去跟美国大使馆讲吧。
And when they got stuck in the reef, the Philippine authorities tried to approach them.
然后当这个扫雷舰它被搁浅在那个郊区的时候，那个菲律宾官方他们试图要接近这个船舰。
But when the Philippine authorities approached them, the U.S. Sailors, the U.S. troops assumed a combat position, meaning they were prepared to fire on the Philippine authorities.
所以当他们接近的时候，反而那个舰队上面的军人就是准备要就是开火，就是要对那个官方的人开火。
So they don't really care so much about our domestic laws.
其实他们并不在意菲律宾当地的法律。
Next slide, please. So, initial reports say that more than 4,000 square meters of the coral reef has already been damaged by the U.S. ship.
所以根据报告，已经有大约有4000平方米的那个珊瑚礁岩已经被船损坏了。
And the latest news is that it would take more than 1 month for them to remove the ship from the reef.
然后就是根据就说他们还要再多花1个月才能够把这个船从这个礁岩当中取走。
And they're going to cut up the ship into several pieces.
就是他们要把那个船就是切成几个部分，然后让它移走。
Next slide, please. So that's an aerial shot of the ship. So it's a big ship. You can see on the left of the ship, that's the reef. That's where it's stuck. So it's destroying the reef where the fish lay their eggs, where the source of marine life is.
所以可以看那个左上方那个图的照片的左边，其实就是那个船舰搁浅的珊瑚礁，就那边其实就是鱼类啊他们在繁衍的地方。那这是他们的构造图。
It will probably take more than 100 years for the coral reefs to grow back.
据说要花超过100年才能够让这些珊瑚礁就是重新再长回来。
And it's not yet clear how and when the U.S. government will actually pay damages to the Philippine government.
而且我们也不清楚，就是什么时候，或是美国会用什么方式来补偿菲律宾这次受到的损失。
Next slide, please. Oops. I missed something. I missed something. No. That's the last one. Oh. Okay, we missed something. Anyway, let's go back up to the reef. There. Okay. Then we have other problems when the ships come in. You know, the ships, they carry a lot of toxic and hazardous wastes.
那个美国的船舰到菲律宾来，还有另外一个问题，就是他们会带来很多有毒的废弃物， 持到访菲律宾。
Last year, Philippine authorities discovered that millions of liters of hazardous waste, sewage material were dumped in Philippine waters, waste that came from the U.S. warships.
所以去年菲律宾的官方发现，就是有数百吨的那个有毒的废水被倒入菲律宾的水域里面。
So, this is not the first time that toxic wastes were left in the Philippines. During the time of the U.S. bases, they also did the same. They left their toxic waste in our country.
所以其实这并不是第一次，在当初美国就是在菲律宾有基地的时候，他们就已经把有毒的这些废弃物和废水倒进菲律宾的海域里面。
And they refused to clean up their mess.
而且他们还就是拒绝，就是处理这些他们留下来的脏东西。
So what we're seeing is that the U.S. presence is dangerous for Philippine sovereignty and dangerous as well for the Philippine environment.
所以可以见得就是美国在菲律宾其实不但是威胁到我们的主权，而且对我们的环境也造成很大的影响。
Next slide, please. That is why there is currently strong opposition to U.S. presence and intervention in our country and in the region. The region.
就是那个在菲律宾，它只是目前正在就是进行的一个反对美国对菲律宾干预的抗议活动。
Next slide. So it took us around 4 decades before we were able to remove the U.S. bases in our country.
其实花了我们差不多40年才把美国基地赶出菲律宾。
And now that they're coming back, we think that it's going to take another long period before we can finally get them out of our country.
不过美国现在又回来了，我想可能又要再花一个很长的期间才可以把美国赶出菲律宾。
And we think it's important that the peoples of Asia in the Pacific are united in the common aspiration for peace and supportive of the aspirations for national liberation of the different countries.
所以我觉得就是在共同期望和平跟共同期望民族自决的基础上面，我们亚太地区的人民团结起来是很重要的。
And we thank you for this opportunity for allowing us to share what we're experiencing under U.S. imperialism and its intervention in our country.
所以今天刚好可以借这个机会跟大家分享，我们就是目前所遇到那个美国对菲律宾干预的一些经验跟事情。
And we stand in solidarity with your struggles for genuine peace in the region.
我们就是对于我们在区域内寻求和平的这个共同的目标，我们在这个目标上面团结一致。
And we look forward to the day that the whole world will finally be free from the clutches of U.S. imperialism.
那我们期待就是有一天我们能就是全世界的国家都可以就是不要再受美国帝国主义的折磨。
Last slide.